In my hometown, there's a forest that's pretty big. There are trails around the edges where people walk their dogs, but no one really goes into the depths of it. Once a month or so, I go there bird watching. There's also a small river, which, in drier months, is basically just a dip filled with mud and leaves. I walk alongside it on my way in and again on my way out. About 2 years ago, I was walking along the riverbank in May or June, when ahead of me, I saw what looked like a pale, hairless, nude person digging around in the mud. I got a bit closer and realized the thing didn't appear to be human. It was quite tall. Its skin was a light medium gray, and it had no facial features that I could discern from a distance, except large sunken eyes. It was squatting and using its hands to rifle through the mud. Its arms were very long compared to a human, and it was very thin. I watched it for about 30 seconds or so, and then it looked in my direction, and I think it saw me, because it paused, and we just stared at each other for a few seconds. It then turned around, disappearing quickly but casually into the trees on all fours. It was a weird experience, but there wasn't anything in its demeanor that made me feel threatened. It was like watching an animal forage. It was calm the whole time. A lot of the encounters I've read on here seem to be about creatures that have a menacing energy, but this thing just seemed to want to go about its business uninterrupted. If anyone has any idea what I might have seen, I'd appreciate it if you could let me know. My first encounter was just after I had gotten my black hat, allowing me free access to the entire mine. I was still wet behind the ears, however, and given a job that was essentially a babysitting gig. Go me. The job entailed watching over a machine called a booster drive. It was a machine that was placed along the belt that transported the coal out of the mine. Its whole job was to keep the belt moving and the river of coal moving out of the mine to the process facility. It's usually a cake gig if the beltmen did their job correctly. I shovel up any spilled coal and call in the cavalry if shit goes sideways. Now, unlike 95% of the rest of the mine, the booster drives had lighting installed. The light would spill up the entryway, only so far, however. Beyond that point was inky black nothingness. I'd been there for a few days already, and kept catching movement out of the corners of my eye. I grew up shooting and hunting, so unnatural movement catches my attention pretty rapidly. It would always disappear when I tried to look directly at it. Thing is, I would feel frightened and definitely threatened when I would catch fleeting glances of it. It felt ominous. One day, after a pretty active day of jerking my head at the blackness and seeing movement retreating into the dark, I got angry, and foolishly, I called out, "I see you." Whatever it was took 2 full strides into the light. It was shaped like a man, same size and height, only it was completely black, a complete absence of light. But it had dimension, a thickness and fullness. I was so scared I got tunnel vision, and it seemed like all of the machinery went silent. I know it didn't, because the belts were still chugging away. It stood there for about 5 full seconds, did an about face, and walked away into the dark. I stood staring at the spot for a good 20 seconds afterward, until my vision cleared, and the steady roar of the booster filled my ears again. My head stayed on a swivel the rest of the shift. When I was relieved, I asked the man who took my place on the next shift, You ever see anything moving around down here? He took a long look at me and replied,
Yes.
What the hell is it? I asked.
I'm not sure I want to know.
He said. I wish I could say I never saw it again. That thing scared the shit out of me. I've seen a lot of Djinn-related posts lately, primarily from military folks. I've been fascinated with these creatures ever since I unfortunately encountered one. For context, I'm American and first became exposed to the concept of jinns after living abroad in Muslim societies. I'm non-Muslim and non-religious, FYI. But the most profound exposure was when I first went to Srinagar, Kashmir. I was invited by a friend and was staying at her home. I don't know if you know the history of Kashmir. You should know that it's the most militarized zone in the world and has had a lot of bloodshed over the years. As beautiful as it is, it's also very eerie as a result. I don't know how to describe it, other than being very creepy at night, with lots of weird sounds. Outside of the city and being in the Himalayas, there's lots of woodlands where jinns supposedly prefer to live. Anyway, while staying with my friend, I noticed things would happen to me at night. Like my legs or arms would randomly be pulled. I thought maybe I was just jolting myself awake, but it happened multiple times each night and was out of character for me. Then, one night, I felt like I had been choked awake. I was so shocked and confused. The next morning, I finally opened up to my friend and her sister about what I had been experiencing. They told me that because I would sleep in only underwear and a t-shirt at night, it was hot weather at the time, I was possibly attracting a djinn, or their house angel, Pacinder. The house angel could be jolting me awake as a way to warn me about not wearing pants, because I might attract a djinn. I was skeptical, but decided to wear pants, and the weird jolting stopped. A few days later, we decided to visit a rural scenic area of Kashmir called Pahalgam. My friend's cousin, my now husband, took us there. Yes, I met him here and we fell in love. When we entered, I started to feel extremely ill. It's hard to describe, but I felt very lightheaded, like I couldn't breathe, and felt an overwhelming sense of dread and anxiety. I honestly felt like crying and wanted to turn around. We chalked it up to the higher altitude, but I had been to other areas with an even higher altitude in the previous days and had felt fine. After sitting at a restaurant for some time, I finally felt better, and we went exploring in the mountains. So, I was frolicking in the hills with my now husband, and we were kissing. First no-no. A bit later I had to pee, so I found a bush and did my thing. For those Muslims reading this, I know. Bear in mind I was a foolish American girl, and my husband did not think to warn me. Because let me tell you, you should never pee outdoors, especially in djinn areas, because it's very possible you will pee on them or their home, and then they get mad. So yeah, this is where things went downhill. I returned back to the UK, where I was studying at the time, a few days later, and I remember feeling absolutely horrible. I was vomiting and just feeling very hazy. I assumed I was just jet-lagged and went to sleep. Now we all know that when you're jet-lagged, you pass out. I slept soundly for like 11 hours, not even waking up to pee once. When I finally did wake up the next day, I hopped in the shower, and my body started to burn. Like really burn. I was so confused why my body was burning, so I looked in the mirror. There were deep, curved scratches all over my chest, my breast, and my stomach. Some in threes, which I think is an ode to the devil. They hurt so bad, and were even a bit bloody. I later found out when a friend looked for me and took pictures that they were also on my back and right above my butt. And they were just in awkward places. I didn't have the nails to make such deep and intense scratches. I just don't know how I could have done that level of damage to myself. I immediately told my future husband, and he told me to recite some verses from the Quran that protect you from jinns, and doing that seemed to stop further activity. I've been to Kashmir many times since, but I refuse to return to Pahalgam. My mom's home is situated in the middle of the Appalachian Mountains. She has one neighbor, her mother-in-law. There are no other houses anywhere around hers, just beautiful mountains. One night, her dog was barking, crying, and growling. She just wouldn't stop. My mom was a tad confused, as there wasn't any outside noises that she herself could hear, and her dog was pacing to the door and windows. After about an hour, she decided to grab her flashlight and go outside to make sure everything was okay, and that there weren't any animals messing with her trash bins. She figured her dog was picking up the scent of a raccoon or other nocturnal animal. She scanned her yard and the creek and didn't see anything out of place. No animals, and her trash hadn't been tipped over. As she turned to go back inside, she saw it. I will give the best description that I can from her explanation to me. It was standing on its hind legs. Its back legs looked animal-like, and its front looked more human. It wasn't hairless, but looked as if it had mange, with long fur here and there. The top half looked like a humanoid man, while the lower half looked like an animal. She stood paralyzed with fear, shining her light on it. It looked at her, and then it dropped down and started walking on all fours out of her yard and into the mountains. As it did, it stopped and looked back at her, then finally disappeared into the darkness. Her second encounter wasn't as intense, but worth mentioning either way. It was weeks later, and her dog began acting out again. She tries her best now to not go outside once the sun goes down. She turned her lights off inside and looked out of her kitchen window. With her outside light, she was able to see it again in her backyard, although it was further away from her and not as detailed. She said she knew instantly it was the same thing she saw just weeks earlier, and it ran chills down her spine. She said she closed her eyes and let go of the blinds. Several minutes later, she looked again, and it was gone. She said it took everything in her to open those blinds back up and look out there. For weeks following, she would shoot her gun right at the edge of dark. Now, anytime her dog acts out, she will scan her yard and then step out on the porch and shoot a couple times. She hasn't encountered it again. This took place in eastern Kentucky in the summer of 2019. This happened to me when I visited Thailand around 2013. My wife and I are both Thais, and we usually go back to visit our family once every 2 years. We made a lot of Thai friends who came to study abroad and went back to their country once they graduated from their universities. This happened when we went to visit our friends in Kanchanaburi. It's about 2 or 3 hours west of Bangkok. One of my friends warned me that Kanchanaburi is an old city, and there's a lot of ghosts there. I brushed it off because this guy loves stories like this, and he also loves to scare people. The friend whom we were visiting, let's call him T, is one of my best friends. We hung out together a lot back when we were in Seattle. T picked us up from the bus stop, and he showed us around the city. It has a lot of nature and sightseeing areas. One of those places is called Death Railway. You can Google search this, but let me give you a brief history anyway. Death Railway began its construction around World War II by the Japanese Army with help from prisoners of war. And by help I mean, whoever didn't do a good job was killed on the spot, and the damn thing is built on a cliff. Needless to say, a lot of people died there. They were building it because they could use this railway to transport their troops and supplies to invade Burma easily. However, in this day and age, Death Railway is just a sightseeing spot, with lots of tourists and small shops here and there. Nothing much was going on. We took a few pictures and looked around. There was a Buddha statue in an open cave nearby. We went there and gave respect. Then we left. As we were walking out, this weird thought forced its way into my mind. I don't know why. I thought, there's probably a lot of dead people here. Right then and there, all of the hair on my body stood up all of a sudden. It kind of felt like you were in a crowd, and everyone was staring at you. It gave me this uncomfortable feeling, and from that moment on until I stepped into T's car and left the place, I kept feeling like I was being followed. Again, I brushed it off, thinking nothing of it, and we continued on with our trip. That night, we went to stay at T's guest house. I remember that it was very dark. Streetlights were far away from the house. The area wasn't as developed as the city. The house was a little creepy, but my friend said he grew up in it, so I didn't worry about it too much. We hung out in a room he prepared for us. We ate some snacks and talked, since we hadn't seen each other in a few years. This whole time, since I stepped inside the house, I felt very uneasy, like I was being watched. It might have just been that the house was old. It was so dark outside, and there were no sounds from the street at all. The only noises we heard were the crickets and our voices. Not long after that, T left to go to sleep. My wife and I took a shower and also went to bed. As I was dozing off, it felt like someone ran their fingers from my right ankle to my inner thigh really fast. I kicked my leg out, thinking that it might be ants or bugs because we had some snacks in the room. I thought this to try to calm myself, trying to think rationally. But in the back of my head, I knew that it wasn't a bug. It didn't feel like an insect. It felt like when you use your index and middle finger and pretend that your hand is walking. But to make sure, I got up, turned on the light, and checked my blanket in my bed. There was nothing, so I laid back down. And after a few minutes, it happened again. I jumped up and turned on the light, and checked again. My wife was very confused. She asked what was going on, but I didn't want to freak her out, so I said nothing. And as soon as I laid down and closed my eyes, it happened again. I was terrified at this point. I kicked my legs out in panic. In my head, I said that I apologized if I disrespected anyone unknowingly or did anything inappropriate. And it worked. It didn't happen again. I was still terrified, but I shut my eyes tight and eventually fell asleep. The next day we woke up, had breakfast, and went back to Bangkok. And I never said anything about it. I live in a small one-story home in the country, surrounded by acres of pasture and woodland. Although we have neighbors, we aren't close with them, and we hardly have visitors of any kind. To say I haven't experienced anything odd or interesting during my time living here would be a lie. I could write a book with the amount of stories I have involving bizarre creatures I've seen roaming the grassy fields around the pond behind our house late at night. I've been sensitive to the paranormal ever since I was a baby, and the experiences run in my family on my mother's side. With this being said, I scare easily. I'm a huge baby when it comes to anything out of the ordinary, so I've had to teach myself how to turn it on and off, so to speak. This particular story, however, takes place long before I learned how to do it. Around 10 years ago, my grandmother who lived with us passed away. I was very close to her, so I took the hit hard. Around this time, the paranormal activity in my household began to ramp up. Toys would turn on and off without anyone or anything near them. We would occasionally feel something tap on our shoulders, and my brother, who moved into her old room a few months later, distinctly remembers a warm breath on the back of his neck when he was alone in the house. We were all rather calm about it, as we believed it was my grandmother hanging around to help ease us into the transition of life without her. I never felt scared or in danger. That is, until one night. I'm a very light sleeper. I inherited that from my mom as well. The slightest sound of the air conditioner turning on at night, and I was always wide awake. This time, however, I awoke to the sound of the floor creaking outside my room. The way my house is laid out, my room, my aunt's room, and my brother's room are all at the far end of the house. One has to walk the entirety of the house from my room, through the dining room, kitchen, and living room to get to my parents' bedroom at the opposite end of the house. I looked at the clock and realized it was a little past midnight. No one would be awake at this time. The creaking wasn't uncommon, however. We had a few weak spots in the dining room and kitchen that would creak occasionally, even if no one was stepping there. Just as I was about to fall asleep again, I heard a second creak, further into the dining room. Again, odd, but not entirely unbelievable. It wasn't until the third creak came just outside the kitchen that I realized it sounded like very slow footsteps, deliberately stepping on every weak place in the floor. I sat up to listen closer. As I did, I heard 3 more very distinct creaks coming back to the door of my room. They stopped right outside my door, then began to pace back in the direction of the kitchen once again. I listened to this repetition for 15 minutes or so, memorizing each of the steps, until I was able to predict when and where the next one would sound. It was so bizarre, but even my little 10-year-old brain tried to reason that it was just the house settling, or an issue with the air conditioning or something like that. But as I said earlier, I scared easily, especially in the dark of night. So I quietly slid out of bed and was planning to make a run for my parents' room. The only problem was that I had to run through the kitchen in order to get there, where the creaking was currently coming from. I steeled my nerves and opened my bedroom door, quietly stepping into the rest of the house. The lights were off. There was no one in the dining room. Just as I was about to start my wild run to my parents' room, I realized the next predicted step didn't come. Instead, I became aware of a much more terrifying sound. Running. Something was running at me from the kitchen, through the dining room. There was no one there, but I could hear it so distinctly. I panicked and ran back into my room, the footsteps right behind me. I jumped into bed and covered myself with the blanket, and the fast footsteps came all the way into my room and right to my bedside, where they stopped. And I didn't hear them again the rest of the night, or the following night. In fact, to this day, it's the only night anything in my house ever made that kind of sound, and I still have no explanation for it. All I know is, whatever chased me through my home that night, it wasn't the spirit of my kind grandmother. In August, the lads and I got together and decided to visit an abandoned World War II barracks that was hit by Nazi bombs. I was carrying a knife on me because it comes in very handy, and this is very vital to the story. So we explored the exterior in search of an entrance, until we found a smashed-in window in the east wing that wasn't hit as bad. We climbed in and arrived in a bare concrete room. I heard something skitter across the floor, presumably a mouse. We walked through the corridors and rooms of the east wing until we came to what we thought was the sick bay, which was in the west wing that was hit badly by bombs. This one room we go into has rubble around the entrance, and the wooden roof is caved in. There is ash, and the walls are blackened. At the back of the room, there is a blackened and rusty metal desk. The desk has a drawer in it. I try opening the drawer, but it's rusted shut, so I go to pull out my knife to pry it open, but it isn't there. I assume I dropped it on the way in, and that I would find it on the way out, so I use a piece of wood to try and open it instead. When I get it open, I receive the biggest shock of my life. Inside is my knife and a rusty ashtray with a smoldering cigarette in it, meaning it must have been put in there while we were in the room. We just legged it after that. Now we tried to dismiss it as a delinquent playing tricks on us, but we all know that the drawer was rusted shut, and there was a smoldering cigarette in there. Now there has to be an explanation for this, but we just can't figure out how it's even possible. Hey guys and ladies, thanks for watching. Links to all my shit are down in the description. Also, I started a second channel to archive all my skits and music, and I'll put a link for that down there too. I love you guys. Be good to animals, even people. Shit.
Yo, snämma, Barracks, Rish.